absolutely. Okay, got it going.
I mean, actually, this is the second podcast today that I've recorded. I did a Fluff and Hammer earlier today, which was lots of
I've been
fun.
watching those. Is that the one on the Horus Heresy series?
No, that's sort of an adjunct to the Fluff and Hammer. We're doing the actual Fluff and Hammer podcast itself is just a general discussion about what's happening in the worlds of Games Workshop and what new miniatures are coming out and whatnot. We're taking a look at the new Slaanesh miniatures which are coming out.
Yes, those are amazing. Actually,
Oh my goodness! I mean, Slaanesh has always been difficult for Games Workshop. It has always been problematic. The miniatures have never been that strong
yes.
for Slaanesh, but I think for the first time ever, they've absolutely nailed it.
Well, I remember hanging around in Games Workshop and hearing a lot of people speculating about whether or not they were actually going to kill off the whole Slaanesh, which was a terrifying notion.
Absolutely, but you know what? The funny thing is, I've been hearing that narrative for such a long time, and yet I've never heard or seen any concrete evidence that it was the case. At all. What they did at the beginning of the Age of Sigmar was they created this narrative whereby Slaanesh was removed from the pantheon of the Chaos Gods because he was imprisoned. Some of the lesser deities like Tyrion and Teclis, the elven deities essentially, found a way of imprisoning Slaanesh, and that was very clever. It was a way of sort of creating a holding pan for the god before they realised what they wanted to do with it. But the thing is, it's always been there. It's always been there in the background, and they've always been building this narrative that Slaanesh was going to be released at some point, and it was going to be a huge event. So that seems to be what they're building towards now.
Yeah, which is it. I think the rumor, the substance of the rumor, seemed to be around issues of Games Workshop being more family friendly and sort of, which is just like, yeah, which is ridiculous because of course, like, you know, in Coin you've got people holding up visceral remains of. This seems to be like a general thing within British censorship that anything gets towards sexuality and then it immediately needs to be censored. But you can have people being carved up and eviscerated, and it's absolutely.
I mean, this is actually something I believe I may have discussed it on a previous. I may have in fact have discussed this with Adam on the Fluff and Hammer at some point. But there does seem to be this core hypocrisy when it comes to censorship, whereby, as you say, anything that's redolent of warfare or of mutilation, of violence, of disease even in Games Workshop. I mean, the graphicness of the Plague Marines and the Nurgle miniatures is unbelievable. I mean, they get away with so much there. And yet, anything that's not, it doesn't even have to be sexuality. It can just be standard human anatomy. And suddenly there's this eruption. There's this incredible lashback. The example I always use is Action Men. Like toys, children's toys. So it's perfectly okay for boys' toys to be these military figures, to be characters who are immersed in violence, who come packaged with little knives and little grenades and Gatling guns and all sorts of stuff. That is perfectly de rigueur. But the moment that one of those figures has even the suggestion of perfectly normal male anatomy, it would cause uproar, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. It's. I mean, I think within Slaanesh, that was exactly the mentality behind it. It was like someone's gonna paint breasts on a water tank, and that's gonna be the end of Games Workshop. I think you see this in across British culture, in our sort of military fetishism, which is really strong in.
Oh, it's huge at the moment. I mean, it's even in like fashion, isn't it? I mean, it's like the most passive thing imaginable has been infected with this militarism. It's really quite. Yes, it makes me recoil quite a lot, I've got to say.
I mean, in that sense, you could find far more disturbing imagery even within the sort of slightly fascist edge to the Imperial Guards, say, where that's sort of right across their army. There's that mentality. I mean, you know, it's which is of course parodied and satired in Games Workshop.
Absolutely,
but
yeah.
It's there, yeah.
I mean,
and
that's
of course
what
the
it
idea
was.
that there's no satire in Slaanesh either. I mean,
of course, there's enormous satire in all of the Chaos powers. Their extremity makes them necessarily satirical, doesn't it? I mean, the over-the-topness of Khorne, where it is just violence. There is nothing else. It is just mindless, rampant violence. Of course, there's a parodic element to it. And as you say, it's this notion that somehow that is more acceptable, the beheadings, the eviscerations and whatnot, that is somehow more acceptable than the ironically, the sexuality, say, of Slaanesh, which is only a very small part of the god anyway. You know, I mean, Slaanesh is not just sexuality. That's why Slaanesh is my favourite of the Chaos Powers, because he incorporates so much. He is obsession, he is desire, he's inspiration, so he can be almost anything.
I think one of the great things about the way the game has expanded is that it's done that for all of the Chaos Gods. I mean, for example, I always often think of the expansion of Nurgle from simply a god of disease to almost a pagan deity of nature, which is fascinating.
It makes him so much more fun, doesn't it? It really makes him so much more interesting. I like the not just the elemental aspects of Nurgle, which have been slowly emphasized, certainly in Age of Sigmar, that he's actually become the equivalent of Alariel now. He is sort of the dark equivalent of Alariel, a nature god, essentially. He's all about the cycles of nature. Whereas before he was just a god of death and disease and despair, and there really wasn't much else to him. I like the fact that the followers of Nurgle are quite jolly.
Yes. They're either incredibly jolly or incredibly depressed as well. So you've got that. You often find that in the two different demons. It's been a while, but the plague bearers who are
morose,
very stern and morose, and then the Nurglings who are constantly running in and out of the innards of the plague bearers
and annoying them. Basically, you can imagine the plague bearers grumbling at them, can't you? Like it's sort of get off my lawn kind of way.
And of course, there's even in a disease that the plague bearers can get, which turns them into clowns, essentially, which is just fantastic.
What's it called? It's something like, it's the giggling pox or something like that. But it turns them into the sloppity bile pipers, which is one of the best names Games Workshop have ever come up with for anything ever, quite frankly. But it is this bizarre disease that inverts their natures. It makes them incredibly fun and happy and manically so in a very feverish way, to the point whereby they burn themselves out.
Yes, they inevitably die, don't they?
Yes, and become like the instruments that the next sloppity bile piper inherits. It's so cool. I love that. I absolutely love that. I mean, one of the things I do hope they do with the Hedonites of Slaanesh, which is a fantastic name, I'm so glad they went with that, is that we get the same thing happening for the Lord of Pleasure, so we get a sort of expansion of him. I would like to see that very much. I mean, that's certainly something that's happened in the background books for Slaanesh. If you look at the some of the Horus Heresy books, for example, that focus on the Emperor's children and on Fulgrim, one thing they focus on, which I think is fantastic, is the transcendental nature of Slaanesh. When Fulgrim starts down the road of Slaanesh corruption, it's like he's having a metaphysical experience. He starts to expand beyond his own prescribed contexts, becoming a different entity with each new excess. And when he eventually erupts into demonhood, the book is very clever. It's in a book called Angel Exterminatus, and when he actually ascends, it doesn't try to describe what he perceives, because it would be impossible, obviously, within the context of language. But what you get is this impression that suddenly the universe and reality blossoms before him. And suddenly he sees everything. He sees the ripples of possibility, the potential futures, the potential pasts, everything that has led him to this point. And suddenly reality is just a playground for him. Nothing
I like
matters.
that aspect of them emphasizing almost the mystic occultic dimensions of chaos increasingly as well, because I think if you reduce the gods just to some one bare concept, pleasure, violence, disease, etc., you tend to obscure all of that.
Oh, absolutely. And it becomes reductive. It becomes incredibly reductive, and it just paints them as bad guys, doesn't it? As nemeses. Whereas I find that the Horus Heresy literature, I mean, it varies in quality. So it's all very pulpy, but some of it does try to elevate the material a little bit, which I really like. They have really gone for exploring why someone would willingly embrace these powers. And it makes perfect sense in a lot of situations. I totally understand why Fulgrim embraces Slaanesh, for example. He's not necessarily coerced into it either. He makes a conscious decision to embrace Slaanesh. I totally understand that. I understand why Mortarion would embrace Nurgle. Angron is slightly different because when he ascends, he doesn't even know who Khorne is when he ascends. It's not his decision at all. Lorgar kind of manipulates it. But even then, when he ascends, he is celebratory. He becomes his own quintessence, like the very, very core of himself is emphasized to the nth degree. And suddenly all of the pain, all of the misery of his previous existence is gone. And in place of it is like a kind of rapture.
Yeah, I think that there's an interesting quality of Khorne, who is, of course, the inverse of Tzeentch, if I'm pronouncing that right, and yet often actually deploys that kind of duplicity. I think he often tries to deploy that kind of duplicity against Sanguinius too, in the way that he attempts to convert Sanguinius to his cause and ultimately fails. And so there's kind of an interesting inversion where the opposites reflect each other.
Well, that is fascinating because there is that was lost for Khorne after the Realms of Chaos books from donkey's years ago. He did have that element way back then, but then it was lost over a period of almost a decade, and he just became this god of violence and hatred and anger. But recently, with particularly the demon books, like the Demon Army books, there has been this reintroduction of that element where the bloodletters of Khorne, they're some of the more intelligent demons and the more manipulative demons of Khorne. They will whisper into the minds of, say, revolutionaries, social revolutionaries, people who want to better their lot and who are angry at the lot that life has given them, and they will stoke those flames. They will whisper to the Imperial Guardsman, the warrior, anyone who has some sort of rage at their own condition, and they will manipulate them in that way. And I really like that. I think that introduces this wonderful complexity to Khorne that he has sort of lacked.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it better reflects just the scale of dystopianism in Warhammer as well, because if you turn these gods into evil gods, just malevolent, then they stop being a reflection of the fundamental fallenness of that universe, that there just is absolutely no hope at all.
I mean, this is the fun I always have when I discuss the moral dynamics of the universe and the philosophical dynamics of the universe. There are no good choices. There are no good choices here. You either fight for this incredibly oppressive dystopian empire, which would snuff you out without thinking about it. It would lobotomize you the moment you're born and have you be just this mindless servitor until your components wear out and you become nothing. The vast majority of humanity certainly is arbitrary. Entire planets can be snuffed out on a whim. Or you serve these powers which, at least they offer potential. At least there's something there. I mean, okay, the likelihood is you will end up going mad or descending into abomination beforehand, but so what? So what? At this point in that universe,
you don't have a lot else. No. And I mean, even on a civilization scale, there's a sense that it couldn't really be other, and I think that's brilliantly reflected in the more satirical dimensions of the Tau, because you get the sense that every utopian project in the Warhammer 40,000 universe is predestined to end in exactly the same way. And of course, the Tau's utopianism is exact mirror of the utopianism of the Emperor as he began.
Yes, it's interesting, isn't it? Because humanity is already there. They've gone through what the Tau are going through now, and it's failed. It's completely failed, inevitably, perhaps. And before that, you had the Eldari, who also went through this utopianism. In fact, the Eldari were perhaps arguably the most successful. in the sense that they once dominated all of creation. They could literally will stars into being and manipulate the state of reality, and even they fell. Humanity never even got to that point. The Necron Tire, before them, got to that point and ultimately failed. There is no project here that is going to work. The only thing that seems to work and sustain, ironically, are they're not, I don't know whether you'd call them civilizations, but the worlds and the cultures that are saturated by chaos. Okay, they are insane, they are lunatic, but they work. They actually do function after a sense, and they sustain. Certainly the ones that are dedicated to, say, Slaanesh or Zeech.
Yeah, or debatably the Tyranids, but
absolutely.
But then, of course, there's a question of whether or not they just sort of inevitably eat themselves out of existence.
This is it. I would like to see at some point some futurescape, some futurescape where the Tyranids have maybe taken over, or you could just have like a little closed off system in the 40,000 universe where the Tyranids have taken over an entire star system. They have dug in and they've started to evolve their own ecosystems and whatnot. What would that look like? How would that function? Does it function, or do they ultimately just end up consuming all of the biomass and then turning on themselves or one another, and then just engaging in this endless cycle of predatory self-consumption? I mean, it's kind of interesting. It is kind of interesting. What happens when a gene stealer cult takes over a world or a system, but the Tyranids don't come?
I've actually wondered about that if it was completely closed off and it just ended up being an endlessly perpetuating system of infiltration until everyone is infiltrated.
Everyone is infiltrating one another. So you start to get like those that were the underdogs and the revolutionaries becoming the establishment, and then the ones that they taught and that they led become the revolutionaries, and it just carries on forever and ever and ever. Yeah, that's a cool concept, actually. I really like that. That would make a great basis for a novel or something like that. It'd be great fun to explore.
I feel the Gene Stealer cults are still underused. I would like to see more. I know there's sort of like get-outs in the Warhammer universe where they can't really infiltrate the Eldar properly. They can't really infiltrate. I'd quite like to see that. Gene Stealer cults infiltrating Eldar, infiltrating Tau, infiltrating Kroot. I mean, Gene Stealer cults in the Kroot would be fascinating.
Well, you've got this weird sort of crossover going on there, haven't you? This is almost cross-pollination, because the Kroot also absorb the DNA of what they consume, and it's hard to say what would happen there. What would result?
It sort of becomes something completely new, maybe, which would be fascinating.
That would be really interesting. I would love to see the result of that one. But the one I would certainly love to see are the Eldari. What would happen if a Gene Stealer cult could infiltrate, say, a Craft world, or an Exodite world would probably be more likely. What could they create? I imagine they'd be more psychically inclined, so maybe they would move away from the Gene Stealer genus and more towards, say, the Zoanthrope. You know, because, I mean, there was I don't think it's in the background anymore, but they did once introduce this notion that the Zoanthropes come from the Hive Fleet's consuming Eldar societies.
That's interesting. That's really interesting.
Makes a lot of sense, doesn't it?
It's always suggested in the background, but never sort of... You see a lot of stuff, I guess, in conversions works with people doing model conversions, and they sort of try and have ideas to make their conversions more interesting, and you do see people... I think I recently saw a bunch of Tau Firecast warriors with Gene Stealer symbology and some of the ridges on their heads. Which
interesting, just to give them that little bit of mythological edge. I mean, the Tau would be wide open, I imagine, to Gene Stealer infiltration, given that they are very happy to incorporate other species and other races. It wouldn't take much, would it?
I think the suggestion that Games Workshop makes is that because they have so many eugenics policies, that would sort of suss anything out.
I see. So they
who have sort of moved away from that under sort of because obviously the Tau have broken apart a little bit.
Yes.
And so I guess there's sort of a lot of room for that.
Totally. There's room for anything. I mean, I've always been a little bit I've been a little bit put off by certain conservative elements of the background of the fan base who are like, oh, you can't do that, or you can't do this. Well, really, there's space for almost anything. The hard and fast rules can be undone very easily in this kind of universe with just a little bit of justification. I mean, in the Thousand Sons Codex, it even sets up the notion that this reality, that the main background of the 40,000 universe describes isn't even the only one. There are multiple potential realities and dimensions and even past histories. I mean, there's suggestions in that codex that the Thousand Sons, because they operate on this level of perception that's far and beyond almost anything else in the universe, they can perceive their own potential pasts and the threads of fate and destiny that lead them to become what they are. And they can manipulate them. They can actually change them. There's this great bit of background in the Codex where a Thousand Sons sorcerer is talking back to his past self and trying to manipulate him to engage in the events and circumstances that eventually lead to his own creation. It's quite wonderful. I love that
It's
stuff.
a wonderful twist on the idea of possession and the quite staid genre of possession, I guess, which I think could sort of use that. I remember when I was young having the very distinct impression, I must have been told by somebody, and I don't think it is actually canon, that the Warhammer Fantasy universe is a parallel dimension to the...
That's right, it is, yes. The Warhammer Fantasy, that used to be the case once upon a time. In fact, there was when I was very young, I don't even think I was a teenager, they did introduce this campaign into the Warhammer Fantasy Battle, and at the end of it, they never came out and said it, they never came out and named them as what they are, but at the end of it, what happened was the armies that did the best in that campaign had new equipment added to their lists, and they were described in very mythological terms, like a magical gauntlet with a magical force field around it that can shatter stone. It was a power fist. There was a sword with magically whirring teeth in its blade. It was a chainsword, and I think there was a lightning claw as well, and one of them was a plasma gun or something. It was there was this. I mean, way back when, right back at the beginning, there was this massive crossover. You could get things like cybernetic augmentations in the Warhammer world, in the Fantasy Battle world. You could get vehicles and things from the 40k universe crossing over into the Fantasy Battle universe. Of course, that stopped quite quickly because it was insane.
Yeah. It's sort of tanks in medieval armies.
Exactly. Although it carried on for quite a while with chaos. Because
of course, with the demon armies, it's still wholesale there.
Exactly. I mean, but even right up to Second Ed 40k, where everything was pretty much established at that point, you got the separation between the two universes at that point. In the Second Ed Chaos Codex, there were these appendix army lists that allowed you to take Chaos Cult lists, which are de rigueur, but also this very weird army list called the Demon World army list. And in that, you had demons, but you also had things like Chaos Knights and Chaos Warriors in the 40k setting. So weird, so strange, that army list, but really quite fun. I kind of wish they'd do it again.
It would be fantastic to see, I don't know, you could sort of maybe incorporate the Tyranids into Warhammer Fantasy as a sort of monstrous species.
Oh, that'd be great fun, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that would just be... And you can easily see how a pitched battle between the Empire and Tyranids or Dark Elves and Tyranids could work perfectly.
Well, in the mortal realms, the AOS setting, there's no reason why that couldn't happen. I mean, it's so wide open now. The universe itself is just been blown wide open. It's not even a universe anymore. It's a multiverse that overlaps with itself. So reality is very flimsy in the new state of play. So the notion that something could gnaw its way through from some other state of play, why not? Why not?
And in the D&D setting as well, sort of, moving closer to the
to the described subject matter.
That has exactly that same. I mean, of course, a huge influence, certainly. Exactly that same polyglot character in terms of I mean, like,
it's totally deliberate. It's totally deliberate. I mean, when the settings of D&D were first established, they really did want to make this as open as possible so that players could come in and create their own world. So it was a narrative exercise, it was a mythology building exercise. So really, despite the fact that there are established elements of the universe like elves and dwarves and even cities and realms and things, they aren't that static. There isn't like one core mythology like there is in, say, Warhammer or Warhammer 40,000. In D&D, the mythology is as loose as it can possibly be. So if you want to play a game that's like, say, Monty Python-esque, it's very silly and it's full of jokes and it's this ridiculous comedic universe, you can do that. You can do that to your heart's content. If you want to play a deathly serious, dark universe, which is heavily mythologized and very sort of psychologically ambiguous, or that has very, very dark metaphysics and has epic storylines, you can do that too. It's up to you.
That's how I've always interpreted, especially the monster manuals. Because, of course, if you look at the monster manuals and you imagine a single universe with all of these different monsters in it, and you sort of got, like, red dragons and T-Rexes running past each other with like, Lovecraftian... It gets absurd very quickly.
Oh, very quickly. I mean... You could not include all of these creatures in the same mythology and make them work. If you were running a story arc, say, a campaign in D&D, it would be absurd, it would be insane. The reason they include so many different types of monster and creature and entity is so that you can tailor your universe. So if you wanted to do like a sort of Lost Valley or like old-style adventure exploration thing where you've got characters going down into some subterranean valley where dinosaurs still exist, for example, you can do that. You can do whatever you like. However, on the other hand, if you wanted to do a Hobbit-style quest to a mountain with a dragon underneath it where your characters have to wander through enchanted woods and encounter giant spiders and whatnot, you can do that too.
I think that's one of the things that Games Workshop gets very right, because it does tailor very consciously. It's got this I think sort of medieval Spanish backdrop. It's got this very coherent aesthetic throughout it. I mean, there are obviously some liberties, like the fact that the key city. In
the Empire.
But it's not Arm is the country. The city.
Athkatla. Is it Athkatla? Is that right?
And it has a sort of an Egyptian style cemetery that apparently goes quite deep underground.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I absolutely adored when I first played Baldur's Gate 2, because that was my introduction into this universe. Really, I'd never really played D&D before. Personally, I'd heard of it. I'd heard of it through the cartoon. The 1980s cartoon. That was kind of my first experience of D&D full stop, and I didn't really know that it went further than that for a long time. I don't think it's ever been as big in the UK as it was in its parent home of the US.
No, I remember when I was a teenager, I got the magazine for a while, the official magazine, and I was subscribed to it, I think, for a 2-year period, and then they just stopped distributing. I never got my money back. They stopped distributing it to the UK because there obviously wasn't as... And of course, I can't remember. It's the same people who do Magic the Gathering.
It's not Wizards of the Coast, is it?
I think it is, yes.
Is it Wizards of the Coast?
Yeah.
Right,
so they just discontinued the subscription service to the UK and I think left all of their subscribers hanging. But it's...
right.
Well, so obviously wasn't selling a lot.
No, the market was never as big here, insofar as I understand. I mean, it's interesting because the US, I don't know whether it filtered over to the UK or not. I was probably too young to understand, but there was a big scare against D&D, like a moral backlash against D&D in the 1980s in the US, a kind of religious moral panic thing where people were proclaiming that it's satanic. It's the same thing that Harry Potter experienced, you know. And
It's the same person, actually. I think there's a guy, I might be getting the name wrong, but I think it's Jack Chick, and he did a series of evangelical comic book strips depicting the dangers of things like Harry Potter, Bewitched, D&D, and how they're going to damn the souls of the children who are allowed to play them, and it became this sort of big moral panic.
It's ironic, really, isn't it? Because what I would say about role-playing in general, not just D&D, is that it is a supremely brilliant exercise in the sense that it is, I hate that term educational, I really loathe it, but it is kind of that. It's not just educational, it's kind of transcendental in the sense that it teaches you to engage with narrative, in this dynamic form of storytelling. It makes you very expressive, because you have to be if you're playing, you know, you're playing a role. You have the mathematical element, but it provides you with this expansive mythology that you have to take into account. So it is, for children to play, it's wonderful. You know, it's a wonderful way of engaging them, and of not just for children, for anyone, really. I found it to be a superb storytelling exercise, and a way of engaging with people and communicating with people. So it doesn't really surprise me that movements and institutions that are based upon the exact opposite of that would take against it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the sort of more puritanical wing of American culture, especially after it was cynically appropriated by the Republican Party to form a new electoral base.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, they need an enemy, don't they? It's totally tribal, and there's always got to be an enemy. In the 1980s, one of those enemies was D&D, unfortunately. But that doesn't seem to have hurt it a great deal. In fact, it's given it this slight luster. It's given it a kind of a forbidden feeling. And now, with the advent of the internet, like board games, D&D has experienced this incredible renaissance. It's incredible renaissance. I mean, people are playing it much more now. They're engaging with it much more, to the point whereby it's become this phenomena again. I mean, there are now, I don't know whether you've ever seen the Acquisitions Incorporated videos. Oh, they're great fun. They are basically the creators, the current writers of D&D. They take a kind of wandering theatre piece across the US where they play these ongoing games of D&D, and they sell out like auditoriums and theatre halls. And it shouldn't work. The audience. It should be the most boring thing imaginable, sitting watching people playing D&D, you know, rolling dice and whatnot. It should be the most boring thing imaginable, and it's not. It's superbly engaging, and these shows go on for hours, like 3 or 4 hours at a time, and they are immensely funny, great fun to watch, and they're part of what got me playing. Certainly, I was watching it and thinking, that looks like so much fun.
Absolutely. I think I saw something like that by the guy who did the Rick and Morty cartoons. He did a series, I think, where he had mostly comedians play, and they turned the game into a cartoon as it went along. It was quite amusing. I've only seen bits though, but I think it was very similar principle.
Well, that's that. I think people are a bit intimidated by things like D&D because it's one of those things where when you first look at it, it seems so complex. There's so many numbers and so many tables and so many things that you have to take into account. But when you start playing it, actually, not at all. It's actually very fluid because the rules they're a guideline more than anything. The rules are so loose. You can do almost what you like with it. So, for example, you have enormous laws of spells and incantations and evocations for different classes and from different schools and all this. But the descriptions of the spells and their effects are deliberately kind of loose. So, for example, let's look at a very basic spell like Ray of Frost. Ray of Frost, I think it's an evocation spell, and all Ray of Frost does is, in the description, the character can conduct whatever ritual they have, you know, they can do their chanting or whatever, and it creates this beam of cold, and you can use it as a weapon, so there is a table that allows you to use it to damage enemies, but you don't need to use it like that. Let's say your character let's say you had a locked door, and there was your party didn't have a thief to pick the lock or something. Well, maybe the wizard or the sorcerer would say, well, my character tries to cast Ray of Frost on the lock to break it, to make it brittle. Any games master worth their salt will say, brilliant, that's wonderful. So you automatically hit because it's a door. It can't move, so you automatically hit. Could you roll a die 20 to see what damage it does? And then they will describe narratively what happens. It's very, you can do that. There is space for you to do that kind of thing.
It's a sort of communal storytelling, and I think that's something that's very absent more generally, so it fills a definite place.
Oh, definitely. It's so much fun. I mean, when I first sat down to play a game of D&D, when I first sat down to DM, to Dungeon Master, essentially, I didn't really know what I was doing, so I just let it go. I just sort of went through and let the players do more or less what they wanted. And that's how you play it. That's actually how you play it. As long as there is a narrative reason for them doing what they're doing, there will be a rule or a dice roll that you can make that accommodates it. And if there isn't, who cares? You just ask them, roll a die 20, and you come up with a number based on what you think is the likelihood of them passing it. In the very first session that I ran, I have a guy who's playing a necromancer who also happens to be an alchemist, so he's constantly wandering around. Like whenever we're in a new situation, he's like, so can my character looks around and he searches for any fungus that might be growing or any weeds that might be growing, and he gathers some of them up and that kind of thing. He encountered at one point a werewolf, and the werewolf leapt at him. That's the way it just came out. And this guy, he's very flimsy. If the werewolf hit him, it would have killed him, basically. It would have just ripped him to shreds. Quick as a blink, he says, I reach into my pack and I throw a random potion at this werewolf. That's just what he said. And I was like, okay, roll to hit. And he rolled a critical, which is a natural 20. So I was like, you know what? The potion explodes in this werewolf's face. It knocks it off course. It slides across the ground. And the potion that you picked from your pack, it has the effect of transforming the werewolf back to its human form. And that I never planned that. That was not something I planned to happen. But because what he did was so in character for what his character would do, and he rolled the natural 20. It was like, yeah, we're gonna storytell this. We're gonna finagle it a little bit, and that's the kind of thing that happens all the time. You find you have all of these plans in your head for how things are supposed to go, and they don't. The characters do different things. They go off the beaten track. They say things and do things that you don't expect. So they start to take the narrative for themselves. It becomes theirs as much as yours, and I think. I mean, apropos of nothing, because I am no inveterate dungeon master or anything like that, but it seems to me that that's the best way to do it.
It reflects in many ways the best kinds of story writing, even in a solitary capacity, because I think if you're writing a narrative and the characters aren't going in any directions that you haven't anticipated, it's because they're poorly designed characters. They don't have enough motivation.
Exactly. It's because they're boring, isn't it? It's because they're one-dimensional. It's because, really, they are just functionaries for the plot, you know?
Which produces terrible plots.
It's the Ayn Rand effect.
Yes.
It's the Ayn Rand effect.
You find it quite often in my genre of utopias too, because, of course, too often the characters are themselves vehicles for what's being conveyed, so
of course.
Tend to be, yeah.
But it can be done really well. I mean, I'm reading Ursula K. Le Guin's Lathe of Heaven at the moment. I'm rereading it, and that has a definite utopianism about it. But it also... the characters are functionaries for the utopian ideals within the book, but they are also characters.
I think it's because with Le Guin, she does something very clever and almost reverse that. So it's what kind of characters would this setting produce,
Yes.
not what kind of characters would convey this setting.
Yes.
And it's a very subtle distinction, but it works really well for her. And I think in almost all of her utopian fiction and her more dystopian and her fantasy fiction as well, that question is always paramount. And I think, her parents were anthropologists, and so she was very interested in questions of how societies mold people in particular ways, and also how people can actually push against those social parameters.
Well, that is emphasized to the nth degree in The Lathe of Heaven. It really is, because you have that very dynamic explored. It's sort of what price utopia, It's a case of, if you have the capacity or the means to create a utopia, almost arbitrarily in this instance, you can just sort of literally dream it into being, or induce someone else to dream it into being. What does that mean for the individual, and how is that limited by the nature of human imagination? I mean, have you read The Lathe of Heaven?
I haven't, not that one. It's high on my list.
It's very good. It is very good because it's so ambiguous. It sets up this situation whereby there is a man who exists in a kind of dystopian state. It's never really explained as to what the status quo is, but it is a kind of day after the day after tomorrow. It's very recognizable, essentially. And he has the capacity, he discovers, when he lucid dreams, it happens. History, reality rewrites itself around him. And he is seeing a psychiatrist because he has lots of problems. And the psychiatrist also realizes this. And the psychiatrist is consistently described as a good man. Yeah, and he has the psychiatrist has all of these ideas about how he can use this capacity to make the world a better place, to realize a utopian situation. Unfortunately, every single time he induces the guy to dream and tries to influence the dreams, the idea that he has does come about, but it comes about in a way that has too high a cost, because of the limitations of human imagination and whatnot. So, for example, one of the big problems in this dystopia is overpopulation. Overpopulation is huge, excuse me, as is starvation, lack of resources, and so on and so forth. So he tries to alter history so that isn't a problem anymore. Of course, how does that happen? A pandemic. A huge pandemic that suddenly sweeps across the globe and is now just an established part of history, which means that the human population on the planet is cut by a third or something to that effect. Likewise, he tries to create a situation where there is no internecine conflict in humanity. There's no war or anything. How does that happen? Aliens be and now humanity is united on this constant military front against these aliens. Alongside all of this, these kind of wry parodies of utopianism, you also have this very intense psychological examination of the dreamer, of the guy who has this capacity and realizes that he has this capacity, and what effect it has on him to know that every time he dreams, he can effectively be rewriting reality around himself. It's very good. It's very cool, I've got to say. Dense.
I like the idea of it's sort of exploring social desire then in many ways, and I think that's a fantastic and very underexplored subject.
Yes, and it's the ethics as well. It's like the ethical problems that come about. I mean, the Doctor's ideas are generally what would be recognised as humanitarian ideas, yeah, but what effect is that having upon the dreamer, upon his patient? And not only that, it places him and the dreamer in the positions of gods, essentially. So it's ethically, there are problems here. Clearly, there are issues that the book explores. It's very good. It's very, very dense, lots of ideas. I suppose kind of difficult to read in many respects. Not because the text is gorgeous, so her prose are just... Oh, honestly, I mean, I'm on a kick now. After rereading this, I'm on a kick. I've got to reread everything she's ever done, basically. I've just got to. But very dense in terms of its ideas and kind of difficult to digest. you need to sit back after you've had a session reading it and think about the ideas that it's playing with.
I'd imagine. I mean, because of the counterfetical realities it's constantly creating, I imagine it would hop from one
Yes.
sort of counter hysterical to another in a way that yeah. I mean, I think a lot of contemporary utopian fiction, interestingly, does that. Especially stuff that came out of the 70s, as was very much Cicada Gwyn's context. Woman on the Edge of Time, for example, by Marge Piercy, features a conflict between two realities. One of which is dystopian, one of which is utopian.
Right, so you have a stark contrast there.
Yeah, and in the center of it is somebody who is trapped in a mental hospital, and you never know whether or not it's actually a product of her delusions. She's in a very desperate state. She's, I think she's a young Hispanic woman who's been involved in domestic abuse, and then through a series of quite racist judgments being sort of shoved into this facility. And so you're never really sure what's going on. But the brilliance of it comes at the contemporary situation and how she navigates that begins to push things either more towards the dystopian future or more towards the utopian future.
So it's almost like the dystopian and the utopian are reflections of her psychological state, but may also be real.
Yes, and are vying for control over the present. And
Wow.
So it's a sort of grand metaphor. There's at least one more that I haven't read, and then there's The Female Man, which I'm not so keen on as a book, but it also has a very similar narrative device where it's. I think in this one they're more definitively parallel universes, and they're actually, because they're dependent upon the timeline, they're actually invading each other and trying to destroy each other more literally.
Okay, so you have a literal clash between utopia and dystopia.
And I think that thing of counterfactuality is becoming. I suppose it's a natural progression of the 19th century time travel. Is sort of where you would go from there. If you've got somebody who has a dream or takes a drug or something and then goes into the future and finds a utopian world. The sort of way to make that more complex, especially with a lot of the sort of meta-textual ideas going out in literature in the 1970s, and ideas around Brechtianism and breaking the fourth wall and such. It does seem sort of a natural progression, a way of commenting back on the genre itself.
Absolutely. I mean, it's something that you find resonance within certain science fiction authors from the 1960s, who were largely massively into the hallucinogen and drug culture and the altered mind states, and how that calls into question notions of personality, and how that in turn reflects outwardly on the collective consciousness of culture and so on and so forth. If you read Philip K. Dick, for example, you get a lot of this stuff where characters, they say, fall asleep in one reality and they wake up in a slightly removed one where they are someone else, and they have this cross-pollination between two contradictory histories going on. And the situation may be no better, it may be no worse, but it is different.
He's fascinating because of the influence, not so much of, because he's often contextualized in post-modernity, and I think that's actually wrong, because he's so enmeshed in this Gnostic metaphysics.
Yes. Oh my God. I mean, you must have read Velis.
Yeah, and it's right, but it's right for even where it's not as apparent. I mean, some of the ending of we need to do Androgymus of Electric Sheep, for example, most of which is eradicated in the movie Blade Runner.
Yes.
And I mean, I think that's fair. They were doing a very different thing with Blade Runner.
Oh, totally. It is like an alternate storyline, isn't it? It's an alternate universe of this storyline almost. The book is so far removed from what you get on screen. It's so far removed.
There aren't many film versions. I think possibly only A Scanner Darkly, I think, would be the only example of a film version of Philip K. Dick that captures something of the original book.
Yes.
Generally they're awful, and just turn him into a sort of pulpy science fiction. It's a slightly kind of 2001 AD kind of thing where it's like, and then there's the twist.
Yes, it becomes very aesthetic, I find. When they make film adaptations of Philip K. Dick stories, it becomes very surface level. A lot of the existential crises, for example, are lost. It's so strange because that is such a core element of Philip K. Dick's work. You know, almost universally in his books, characters, protagonists end up realizing they're not who they think they are.
I think it's hard to fit within traditional Hollywood formulas, and so it's something that's sort of inevitably lost. The hero arc is, of course, the predominant. Especially within science fiction in Hollywood.
And that is, again, it's so bizarre in adaptations of Dick because you don't really have heroes. You just don't. You have these very damaged, very broken characters who don't understand why what's happening to them is happening. It's bizarre to me, but yeah, I think A Scanner Darkly probably comes closest.
Yeah. I mean, it has its flaws. It's not a perfect rendition of the book by any measure, but it gets that sense of... Well, I think it especially gets the psychedelia. It gets the comedy. It's one of Dick's funniest books. So often,
totally.
I think often Philip K. Dick is inadvertently funny. I think he often is. He kind of does lots of very absurd and extreme things within that Gnostic mysticism, and they kind of end up being sort of funny. But I'm not sure he means them to be.
No. I mean, A Scanner Darkly. It's ironic that one is the most comedic because, of course, that's also the most autobiographical.
And most tragic in that sense because, of course, it reflects on his experiences of people with drug addiction.
Absolutely. Paranoia, schizophrenia, other conditions. Have you ever listened to the commentary tracks on A Scanner Darkly?
No, I haven't. I should actually.
One of them is his daughter. It's actually Philip K. Dick's daughter talking about her. It's really fascinating because she talks about her experience of living with Philip K. Dick. She didn't live with him for very long because her mother took her away from him. But she was saying that this was our life. This is not an exaggeration. This is what we lived for the longest time, where we would have these strange people just turning up, living with us on our sofa, who would do the strangest, most deranged things, who would talk about the most abstruse, bizarre things. We would have situations where Dick himself, because Dick's mind was totally blasted by prescription drugs at that point, he would think that they were replicants or that they were some sort of hallucination or government-controlled or alien-induced androids or something come to spy on him. And it was a very strange experience of reality, especially for the first 5 years of her life, which is when she lived with them. It's fascinating stuff.
Definitely do that. I think I have a copy of the DVD lying around. I often avoid audio commentaries because they tend to just be a bunch of actors trying desperately to talk for an hour and a half.
Yeah.
Which is, but yeah, that definitely sounds more. I'd imagine on a film like that. It was made by the same guy who did Waking Life, I think.
So I understand, And at the time, of course, it was very experimental as well, using that sort of shaded cell rotoscoping technology. Highly experimental, very stylish, and works very, very, very well for a Philip K. Dick story. Because you get this heightened reality element, where everything is slightly hallucinogenic anyway.
And of course, you can shift back and forth between more and less naturalistic aesthetics very, very fluidly, which is I think I sometimes feel like Waking Life fits almost perfectly within the same framework as A Scanner Darkly.
Well, I could certainly see why the director, having done Waking Life, would want to be introduced to something like Scanner Darkly. I imagine it's a key influence.
And they both share that same comedic but quite pessimistic gloss I guess it's the sort of hanging on to Americana while seeing it decaying around you, which is definitely there.
It's sort of something you find in Hunter S. Thompson as well, isn't it? You know, this it's the death of the 60s, isn't it? It's the death of the spirit of the 60s. You know, you have this incredible sort of utopianism happening within 1960s Americana, where younger generations seem to think that there is going to be this vast revolution, that there's going to be a liberation movement that will never stop. It will just cascade into the future, and eventually you will have this incredibly environmentally aware, sexually enlightened, psychologically aware, spiritually awakened situation, and it just doesn't happen.
Yeah. I think in the last podcast we did together, you actually mentioned that brilliant line in Fear and Loathing.
Oh yes, the high watermark line.
Yeah, and I think that it is incredibly tragic because of course there are things that sort of endure out of that counterculture, and if you sort of see the sort of more ghastly reactionary aspects of that, Charles Manson being taken on by, I don't know, a figure like Boyd Rice in the 80s and 90s, and then the alt-right now in their hideous, ironic fascism. That seems to have endured in a more stable, albeit very disturbing fashion.
Which sadly, I suppose there's an argument to say that it inevitably will, because it is more, it's more coherent, and it's also more grounded in tradition. It's more grounded in our histories, you know? And it's very, very difficult to argue for the alternative in that regard, because they have the weight of assumption on their side.
Yes, yeah, and I think it's a very, I think the argument against it is to point out the shallowness of that counterculture as a counterculture, that it simultaneously allies with the most entrenched forces, the most traditional forces, and calls itself radical. And
this is it. This is the core hypocrisy, isn't it? What you actually have, certainly in the alt-right, and certainly in those that would not describe themselves as alt-right, but as sort of like the dark intelligentsia of, say, YouTube or whatnot, people like Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro and so on and so forth. They would describe themselves as counterculture, undoubtedly. They would prescribe this narrative that there has been a kind of left-wing, almost oligarchy happening, which is simply not true. It's simply untrue when you actually look at the status quo, when you actually look at history. There has never been this thing. There has never been this vast institutionalized enshrinement of left-wing ideals or of the kind of revolutionism that they claim is now standard. They would call themselves revolutionary, when actually what they are just the postmodern manifestations of the establishment.
Absolutely. I think in many ways what they do is they sort of invert the old Whiggish history, so that idea that formed in places like Britain and America, that there is a linear development away from the period of medieval Catholic superstition to a period of secular liberal humanism, and that it's actually a very teleological history, one thing naturally progressing into the other. And so they would read back on events and edit out barbarities committed by modernity as it was emerging, and create a very distorted version of history. And in many ways, I think the far right have just turned that on its head, so that it's the same linear history, except instead of some glorious triumphalist march towards progress, it's this horrific move away from an absolutist hierarchical form of utopia.
Yes, and it is always backwards looking as well, isn't it? It's a kind of a retrospective utopia, this regressive history, where they sort of enshrine and promote this kind of bucolic notion. In the UK, it's very bucolic anyway, where there is this kind of Peter Hitchens view of what the UK used to be, or of what the UK should be, and it's never been true. It's always been a delusion. It's always been a fantasy, except for very particular groups born into very particular circles. And even then, it's a delusion, you know?
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, I mean, the danger of that is that it ties very well into a consistent narrative that's sort of conveyed to people, even through establishment circles, even through the way that history is often conveyed and through mediums on the BBC and etc. etc.
Hmm.
That there's this very linear development, and it can be interpreted in these different ways. And it's created, I think, especially for the left, which of course isn't really a part of that history of
No.
Whiggish progression at all, is a sort of countercurrent to that as well.
Hmm.
I'd argue far more than radical conservatism ever was. And it creates a distorted impression that is really hard to cut through. It's very difficult to get away from frames. I think it's
Yeah.
you can challenge people on particular facts, empirical claims, etc. But the way that people frame things is much more difficult.
Absolutely, because within those frameworks, it's very easy to create consistent and arguments that sound like they're very coherent, very convincing, even when they are simply faults at the level of assumption.
I mean, not
It's a
that they don't. Sorry, go on.
Oh no, sorry. Please go ahead.
Not that they don't make empirically untrue claims, of course. I mean, Jordan Peterson, I recently read an article where he was talking about, I'm probably mispronouncing the name, but the goddess Kali, and he was reducing this sacred notion to simply feminine chaos bad.
Oh God, yes. Oh, this. Oh my God. I mean, as someone who was immersed in occultism once upon a time, when he starts talking about that bullshit, I want to wring his neck. I'm really sorry. It's white noise. It's white noise. It was never ever, even in like the time of Gilgamesh, when that story was set down on stones, it was never the case that the feminine aspects, the Tiamat aspects, the chaos, the ocean, the creative impulse was never presented as a negative. It's a balancing factor, and the way he presents these things is just it's so narrow.
Yes, yeah, and I mean, it's that sort of Procustes bread thing where the sort of myth of Procustes, where he's got a bed of a particular size, and he either stretches people out or cuts them down to fit in the bed.
Yes.
And it's exactly what he does. He forces things to fit into his quite bigoted worldview. And
Yeah.
I think, I mean, you mentioned Gilgamesh, and that's a fantastic example to sort of go against that archetypal reading, because of course in Gilgamesh, the civilizing factor is directly represented in that poem as a prostitute, and
Exactly.
the man is the wild, untamed, and you find these reversals all the time.
All the time, and certainly in ancient mythology, which people like Peterson reference all the bloody time, but do so. I hesitate to say that they deliberately misrepresent, but I kind of feel they do.
I get the sense that they do. I mean, Peterson is supposed to be a Jungian, although I think his Jungianism is massively overstated. And I wouldn't call myself a Jungian, but the one thing I would acknowledge about Carl Jung is that he did study mythology in incredible depth. And if you've studied Jung, it's hard not to know that these kinds of things just don't work.
Yeah.
So I mean, I have a huge amount of problems with the ideas of Friedrich Nietzsche. But even if you've studied Nietzsche, you'd know that some of these ideas are vastly simplistic.
Simplified, absolutely, yeah, absolutely. It's the same thing you get in Ayn Rand, of course. She obviously read Nietzsche and either didn't understand the complexities of what he was expressing, or chose to deliberately simplify them to create a philosophy, in inverted commas, of objectivism. I mean, as you say, Nietzsche himself, when you even do understand the complexity and ambiguity of his ideas, even then is problematic. But to have this reduced form, which is essentially, it's just it can be boiled down to well-stated selfishness. That's what objectivism is. It is a case of I've got mine, go away.
And she's always perplexing to me. I one of the books I read during my adolescence was a very strange text called "The Ego in Its Own" by Max Stirner, and Rand plagiarizes Stirner quite a lot. She very rarely mentions him.
Right.
And Stirner was a young Hegelian who created this bizarre notion of egoism, psychological egoism. He didn't really believe that there was any such thing as ethics. Ethics was something that would be over the top of your ego and therefore rejected. So it was a very extreme sort of notion of ego.
Yeah.
And he had a dialectic, so that there was a pattern of, you begin in a sort of childish egoism, primitivism, which he racialized quite awfully. Associated it with Africans and so on, and then you went into the Christian spiritualist phase where you denied your ego to other things, and that was associated for whatever reason with Asian people, and then there was the Paramount, which is of course Caucasian and is the true resplendent egoist. And there's a lot of, he was very poetic. He's mostly endured now because for whatever reason Karl Marx was obsessed with him and spent a huge amount of time just rebutting his ideas and completely like the German ideology has a section devoted to attacking Max Stirner, which is longer than all of the works of Max Stirner put together.
Oh, I love it. I would love to read that. I'm going to have to search that out, definitely.
Very fun. I mean, I think partly it was because Engels was sort of flirting with Stirner's ideas, and that disturbed poor Marx a bit. So he said, and of course Marx was very engaged with the Hegelian tradition. But Stirner's constantly, even in some of the language that Rand uses in the background, then there's her odd obsession with Aristotle, which completely contradicts a lot of her, Friedrich Nietzsche stuff. She was just very untrained. I mean, this is.
Sorry, go ahead.
So no. I was just saying, there's parts of her where it feels like she's presenting a somewhat coherent, very politically awful neo-Aristotelianism, and then she'll just go completely in some other insane direction.
Well, this is part of the problem I have with the worldview that she certainly the agenda of her fiction, if not her philosophy. It's the notion that. Certainly that people who promote her as a kind of enlightened philosopher or as an ultimate philosopher, they seem to feel as though there is something coherent here, when there simply isn't.
The movement that she gave rise to, and they create encyclopedias of her work.
I know.
All the ideas are, and of course, if you ever argue against one of these people, I'm sure you have.
Oh, it's a waste of time. It's a waste of time. I mean, you can go onto any, just type Ayn Rand into YouTube and then go and look at the comments section of any random video, and you will find people who will point out the contradictions, the hypocrisies, the not just the philosophical inaccuracies, and but also the things she just got flat out wrong, which are just demonstrably wrong. And there is nothing you can say or present that will even result in a considered response. It will result in what you usually get is it's the standard thing you get from Jordan Peterson fans, ironically, because I find the dynamic is the same. And when boiled down, I believe that they're both appealing to very similar conditions within the human breast, similar humours, if you like. It's always this, you're only saying that because you're a loser and because you don't live up to this standard that Rand is promoting. It's this very reductionist perspective on humanity. So that the good and the great and the intelligent aspire, and those that there is no such thing as circumstance. There is no such thing. You have to ignore history. You have to peel away every context that complexifies things in order to buy into these philosophies.
Yeah, it is. I mean, reductionism is the right word. I mean, with Jordan Peterson fans, it's actually quite tragic, because his whole appeal is, you're a loser and I'm going to sort out your life, and then the defensiveness around that is so clearly tied into the sense that his fans have that this is somebody who's helped them get their lives into order.
Which, if he has, then fine. You know, I really am not questioning I'm not attacking the whatever positive benefits that his work has provided people. And if people have read 12 Steps to Life or whatever, and they have taken away from it the self-help elements, and they have worked for them, fine. Good, excellent. That's absolutely fine by me. The problem I have is when they take it a step further and there is this almost religious adherence to the man's words. There is this lack of critical faculty when it comes to his wider agenda, which despite his proclamations, I don't have an agenda, you know, he does. He so clearly does. And you can see it when he talks about, for example, progressive movements against, say, oppressive movements. Now, there's a very good interview with Jordan Peterson where he's talking about the Nazist movement, literally talking about the Nazis. And he presents all of these reasons for why the Nazist movement came about, why just normal people would buy into it. And the arguments he presents are always circumstantial. He talks about context and for why people's psychologies and perceptions and assumptions were altered by those contexts. But then when you compare and contrast that to when he talks about progressive movements, people who were arguing in favor of civil rights and whatnot, he ignores all of that. He completely ignores the influence of context and whatnot, and he just condemns them as ignorant, as entitled, and so on and so forth. It's really quite telling. That's when you see the agenda coming out. That's when you see, even if he doesn't know it, even if it's, say, an unconscious thing, that's when you see it coming out, and that's what really disturbs me, because he is very much a soundbite intellectual, you know?
Absolutely. I mean, that double standard, which you see so often in people who call themselves classical liberal or something like that these days, especially, it's become a more and more common thing. Where
a common euphemism.
The left is sort of reduced to the most simplistic terms.
Yeah.
And often itself undifferentiated from broader liberal progressivism, which is not even left. Whereas the tiniest nuances of 1950s proto-fascism are dissected and comprehended and given a huge amount of leeway and subtlety and appreciation, etc., etc. And the priorities do speak, I think, quite loudly in those instances.
Oh, absolutely. It's the same dynamic you find with, I suppose you can find a very popular example in acts that are considered to be terrorism. It is that thing whereby when the terrorist or whoever commits the act is white, English speaking, there tends to be a very different promotion of them in popular media than if they happen to be Arabic or black or whatever, whatever dynamic they happen to come from. That is kind of a microcosm of exactly the same psychology, and it relates back to what we were talking about before, where the more oppressive, I suppose what you would naturally call the more the powers of conservatism are more embedded in our history and our assumptions and our processes than what would generally be considered more progressive notions. So it's very difficult. It's so difficult to call them into question. It's so difficult to uproot them and to assess them for what they are, to hold them up to the light of examination.
Yes, yeah, and even sometimes I think the way that notions that are assumed to be progressive that have become very codified can be not challenged, not examined in that way.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
I mean, assumptions about how to tackle fascism, I think, are rife with that. Notions that, for example, the best way to deal with fascists is to push them into the marketplace of ideas. That's the phrase.
That's what you hear a lot.
And the idea, of course, that the Weimar Republic being actually one of the places where free speech was most enshrined, that again gave rise to the worst incarnation of fascism. It's certainly in the damage it wrought. And certainly that's not an attack on notions like free speech.
Not at all, no. But it is holding what they call the marketplace of ideas. That's a very common phrase at the moment, isn't it? It's holding that to account. It's allowing for the complexity of it, because it is simply not the case that bad ideas die under the light of examination. It simply isn't the case. History demonstrates that that's not true. Current culture demonstrates that that's not true. I mean, we currently suffer in the UK under a Tory government that has basically done everything it can to disgrace itself and to denigrate the entire culture. And yet, despite the fact that these issues are painted broadly across every aspect of our culture right now, there are people who will still argue for them and still vote for them. It is simply not the case.
Absolutely, and if you're sort of, when you're, one of the things I've done in the past is canvassing work, and I've had instances where I've gone up to people who are in tremendously terrible situations. I think I once knocked on the door of a woman. She was severely disabled. She had almost no support at all. She was complaining that there were threats to throw her out of her house, etc., etc., etc. But her biggest complaint was immigration and black people coming over, and you see that over and over again. The idea that you can just simplistically expect things to right themselves under the light of reason.
It doesn't work. It simply is a falsehood, and it's something that, quite frankly, I do believe that proponents of of that very notion are arguing in bad faith by and large. I do feel that very distinctly. I don't believe they mean what they say, and that is a real problem. That is a real problem in our discourses, in the sense that there are certain circles, certain philosophical and ideological circles, who are very willing to argue in bad faith if it means that their agendas are more normalized or more accepted. And we are seeing that. I can certainly see that in even our day-to-day discourses at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, you look at it. I think people like Ben Shapiro are so emblematic of this. The talk of the marketplace of ideas, and then onto his show, he invites a cavalcade of far-right reactionaries.
Yes.
And probably less than 1% of his invitees are. I don't think any of his invitees could be described as firmly of the left, but vaguely liberal progressive.
Yes.
And it's so obviously disingenuous. And yeah, but then assumptions can disguise that, and I think that's how they operate. You can, the assumption is that it's better to challenge the far right than to give the left a platform. That ideas about free speech, when it comes to defending the rights of neo-Nazis to talk, can suddenly go out of the window when it comes to defending the rights of anarchists and communists to
absolutely
to advance
absolutely.
Their ideas. And it is telling.
It is something I think that operating in certain subcultures helps to reveal that very concept to you. I mean, because I identify as gay, I have argued and debated with a lot of people who will utilize every politicking argument, every euphemism, every bit of obscurantist language they can. But what they're ultimately saying is they don't like gay people and they wish they were dead. That's what they're saying. That's ultimately, that when you boil it down to its essence, that's what they mean.
With just
that's
enough
actually
plausible
what they
deniability.
Mean.
Yeah. I mean,
I think you just have to learn. Sorry.
No. With the far right, the way that they can count. I mean, euphemisms are one of their favorite things. Race realism becomes racialism.
Yes, yeah. Oh, we're not racist. We're nationalist.
Yes.
As though that's any better.
Yeah, I mean, a term that's become, I think, increasingly in vogue. Francis Fukuyama, the guy who thought that history ended in the 1990s and is now subsequently for various reasons, had to revise that view, has launched a massive sort of defense of civic nationalism as opposed to ethno-nationalism, which is very spurious, I often find, and completely ignores the way that nationalism inherently tends towards notions of ethnic supremacism.
Of course, just by its very nature. I mean, it is a euphemism. It is ultimately a euphemism, and it's that erring away from simplicity, I think, and from clarity that these forces really thrive in. It's not the marketplace of ideas, it's the mire, it's the swamp of ideas where they actually proliferate. And it's very difficult to find a way of detoxifying that swamp, of cleansing it, you know?
I mean, a question I often ask people who do these arguments, especially if they sort of liberals who argue with fascists, is a sort of almost genre.
It is actually, it's almost like an industry, isn't it, at this point?
Yeah. I always ask something like, how many of these debates have you won? How many people have you shifted? How many people have gone up to you afterwards and said, oh, actually, having debated with your progressive views, I've suddenly see that I'm wrong.
Yeah.
It just doesn't happen. The only times I've ever seen that happen are actually not through a debate platform, but through things like some of the left tube people I've seen just by sort of relentlessly critiquing and attacking the lies and deceptions of the far right, have pushed people, not from the far right itself, but who are sort of at the margins of it, away from those margins. That, as far as de-radicalization goes, otherwise it seems to depend on some break in people's lives.
Yes, I think that is likely more successful, to be honest. It's when the Republican senator who is vociferously anti-gay has a gay son, isn't it, or a gay daughter? It's that kind of thing, or
sometimes even an unrelated break where just everything goes wrong in their lives and that causes them to reappraise a bit.
Yes. Yeah, it's a revelator. It's a Saul on the road to Damascus moment, isn't it?
And expecting just a calm it misunderstands how people form their ideas and how people's ideas tie into their notions of themselves.
Absolutely, yeah.
If ideas lack that level of robustness, people would be flip-flopping between ideologies all the time.
Absolutely. You would actually have no coherent personality, would you? You'd be all over the place, and you wouldn't have any coherent tribe. You would just be all over the place. One moment you'd be going to EDL rallies, the next you'd be going to Jeremy Corbyn events. It's really quite strange. And I do think it demonstrates a fundamental lack of understanding of how people formulate opinions and how visceral that can be. It is not an intellectualized thing a lot of the time. In fact, I would hypothesize, I don't know whether it's psychologically true, but I imagine that a lot of what can be demonstrably true sounds very counterintuitive when it's given to us in a rational sense. I mean, a very good example would probably be evolution. It doesn't seem to be correct because we can't perceive it, We actually can't step back and watch it happening.
And the cutting edge sort of physics out there right now is profoundly counterintuitive.
Oh, it's so baffling. I love to read about it. But I don't understand a word. I'll be honest.
So I heard it said that in many ways Parmenides is seen as sort of a key figure in the intellectual development leading up to contemporary science, not because his metaphysical assumptions are well grounded or convincing, but because he postulated an idea of the world that is so profoundly counterintuitive, that there's only one thing out there, that everything else is an illusion, that separateness is itself an illusion, time is an illusion, that opened up the idea, and I'm sure this is overstated, that reality itself could be profoundly counterintuitive. And so, I think that's actually a bedrock of most contemporary science, that that reality as it actually is, it could be profoundly different to how it's experienced in everyday life.
And I think it's a very good bedrock it's a very good assumption for wider thought, I think, and for building some kind of ideology, or at least not, if not something as concrete as an ideology, then a particular a sphere for arguing or debating with oneself and with others, you know? Because it seems to me, it's an idea that has a lot of weight. It is an idea that has a lot of weight. I operate under the assumption, certainly, that reality is not as I perceive it to be on any particular level. And with that, Rowan, I think shall we call this one a day? Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, we were going to talk about Baldur's Gate 2. Maybe next time.
Yes, yeah, I probably have played it more. I've been doing the Let's Plays sort of...
Yes, go and watch, by the way, ladies and gentlemen. You know, it's been so much fun watching you play it, because it's one of those games where you can play it... Everybody plays it in different ways. So seeing you tackle the different situations and the different quests in ways that I didn't when I played it it's really fascinating. Really fascinating.
I tend to take a very... Because I when I was young, I played it probably well over 100 times. It was
yeah,
sort of
likewise.
My big obsession game. And I also had very formulaic ways of playing it. Like, I was obsessed with collecting all of the different unique objects.
Yes, likewise.
Balancing them with these sort of bags of holding and making sure I had characters with sufficient strength that they could hold some of the more ridiculous items. And so I tend to play very meticulously and slowly, which I think is the best way to enjoy the game. One of my criticisms, especially with the first arc, is that the game has a way of rushing you along a little bit.
Yeah.
The companions, of course, immediately start complaining if you don't go on their own particular quests.
And you can get some very bad situations occurring from that, can't you? They can actually, some of them can turn against you, some of them can leave, some of them can even fight you.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. It's especially when you've got two with a pressing quest at the same time, so you've just basically got to decide which one you want to keep.
And the ones that conflict with one another. I remember when I first played it, I had both Viconia and, is it Corden, the Templar of Helm?
They won't work together.
He tried to kill her.
Yes, he's crazy. Lawful good characters, with the exception of... I think I actually mentioned this in my latest one, with the exception of Mazzy Fenton, who I actually quite like as a character. Lawful good characters are generally awful.
They're much more violent, aren't they? They're much more inclined to violence. I mean, okay, Viconia can be a little horrible at times, but she's only horrible. You know, she's only a bit spiteful. That's all she does. She needles him about the fact that if you follow a particular story arc, then his family all end up dead, basically. And okay, that's horrible. But she doesn't actually do anything to him. He's the one who starts attacking her with a big magic sword.
Edwin has some terrible things in his past, but mostly he's just comic relief.
Oh, he's great. I love Edwin. I wanted... One of the things I really wanted from the game, I wanted there to be a romance option for same-sex characters with Edwin. I really like Edwin. He makes me smile. He does make me smile.
That would be good. There is a lack of good romance plots in... I mean, I'm not a huge fan of BioWare romance plots generally. They
tend to be very narrow.
Yeah. It's good that they've expanded them quite a bit so that they're not all just the same heterosexual plot line.
That's my cat, by the way. Sorry about that.
but I generally just avoid them out of hand. The word, I mean, I think pretty much all of them in Baldur's Gate are atrocious. I think. I don't know. The airy one is the one that's sort of forced on you most. If you keep
I
on your
hate
party,
the airy
which is just
one.
a really... She's not a well-developed character. She suffers from that sort of... I can't remember the expression, but I think it's like ludo fallacy or ludic fallacy or something like that, where like imagining this person who is unutterably weak and completely a victim going around fighting dragons.
I know, right? Being this incredibly powerful sorceress, it's like... Yeah. It's not just an RPG problem, it's a video game problem where you have victim characters who are actually really powerful. Yeah, and also she's just an annoying character.
Yeah, she complains more than any other character. The character she can't be in the party with, and I've actually currently got them both in the party, so I'll have to resolve that. Is Corgan, because Corgan teases her endlessly in ways that are quite amusing.
Again, I love Corgan too.
Yes. Corgan is brilliant. I mean, I don't. He doesn't really do that much that's evil either. He mostly is just a drunk.
Yeah, he's never that bad, is he? He can be a bit aggressive.
He's a con artist and he's a drunk. There's nothing else, really.
And yet he's established as, like, chaotic evil, isn't he? He's, like, supposed to be the really evil character in the party, and he's just not.
I mean, I think, like, in terms of characters, I think Keldorn is the most psychopathic of all the good characters. Yes. Nalia is a pretty awful person. She's essentially just a sort of spoilt brat.
Yeah, who believes herself to be Robin Hood.
Yes, and the combination, which I think, I mean, to be fair to the game, it does consciously.
It doesn't actually comment on that. If you have some characters in your party, I can't remember who it is, but one of them does say, you are pretending, you are playing at this.
I think two of them, actually. I think Immerwin does. Immerwin's dialogues are usually very good. The problem with her is that after you rescue her from Spellhold, she has nothing to do as a character.
No. She's just done, isn't she, by that point?
Yeah. The best dialogue, I think, is actually between Jan Jensen and Minx. I love their sort of... Because, of course, Jan Jensen is constantly trying to steal Boo. And there's this whole arc between them that is just brilliant. I don't usually have him in my party, Jan Jensen, because Illusionist Thief is not an especially useful
at all. Certainly not when you get into, like, the big dungeons, the really nasty stuff. He is useless.
Absolutely. You end up having him with his bow, sort of firing useless shots and then occasionally a magic missile.
Yeah.
The illusionist, I think all the mage subclasses are generally that good.
No.
Because they just limit the spells you can have.
That's right, yeah. It's one of those things where the different spellcaster classes work really well in the tabletop game. They don't necessarily work very well in the video game. Like certain spells, like the wish spell, completely worthless in the video game. Completely worthless in the tabletop game. It's the most powerful spell.
In the whole using the wish spell, I think, that can get you out of a fight and into your subplane in if I remember, this has been like ages, in Throne of Bor, and then you can sleep and then go back out.
And keep the fight going.
So this is brilliant for boss fights. I'm not very good at these games, so I came up with so many ways. The worst of them, I mean, so a trick using Farsight. So you Farsight a room, summon a bunch of creatures, send it into the room, let them fight the creatures, sleep, Farsight again, and just do that.
Yep. That there, you've just described my tactic for coping with the entire game. If I did a Let's Play of it, it would be so boring, because that is how I tackle every situation in the game. If I want to go and look at the monster, I might, like, creep around and have a look, but that's about it. I send elementals and summon monsters and planar entities to go and do it for me.
This is one of my problems with the Let's Play. I'm actually having to play it more like a player who's actually good at the game.
Yeah. I have that problem with Dark Souls, so I wouldn't worry about it. You know, you have to. It's a case of fake it till you make it, I think.
Yes, yeah, I'd say so. Neutral is another odd alignment in terms.
Oh, it's never worked. It's always even in the tabletop game. Neutral. Well, what does that even mean? What? How are you going to act neutrally? You're just not going to care about anything, or what?
Baldur's Gate seems to have come to two completely separate conclusions, which applies to different characters. It's either characters who are like Valiga, sort of. Well, actually, he isn't even neutral, is he? Or Yoshimo is, I guess.
Yoshimo is technically neutral, and I can kind of see that
because he serves his own interests, I guess.
Yeah, I can kind of get Yoshimo, because he is kind of amoral, isn't he? He doesn't really have any particular... But even so, he's technically a good character, isn't he? He's...
One to hurt anyone. I mean, Jansen's exactly the same as that. He's not... he's just crazy. He's not
Yeah.
mean. And then there's things like Jari, where it's actually turned into an ethic of balancing awfulness against goodness. Or
I have no idea how to keep her happy.
there is no way to keep her happy.
Like, whatever you do, she moans.
She definitely doesn't. I generally get her out of the party first thing.
Yeah, she's such a harper.
Yes, yeah, she is like the absolute epitome of that whole group. Actually,
Yes.
her quest is hilarious because she drags you into this place where you're immediately sort of put on the spot by the Harpers, who obviously want to kill you because you're a child of Bol. And they give you a series of questions, and no matter what you answer, they'll interpret the answer as the worst possible thing. So they'll ask you, what is your favourite colour? And if you say red, they'll say the colour of blood. And
The colour of blood. If you say black, the colour of the colour of decay and death.
yeah, yellow, pestilence, and and then they try and do that spell on you where you end up being transported to the centre of the earth and put into stasis.
Yeah,
which
it's so silly.
Their organisation in many ways seem more evil than
Like the Zentarim or whatever. The thing is, for a good DM, I think it would be great fun to play with that, you know? So if you could create a political tension between the Zentarim and the Harpers and demonstrate that the Harpers are, if not as bad, at least pretty terrible. It wouldn't be that difficult. It certainly wouldn't be that difficult. You could make the Harpers the antagonists very easily.
Most of the Inquisitor organisations as well.
Oh god, like the Servants of Helm and whatnot. Yeah, Lathander and whatnot. Easy peasy. Yeah, it's not difficult to make a lawful good character an antagonist. It really isn't.
No. I love the dynamics of the no alignment in that thing. Like if you actually thought of this in terms of how that could integrate with a society, you could have people casting no alignment spells on children as they grow up to make sure that they're in the right path, and you sort of semi-fascistic use of magic.
I love it. Yeah, it'd be brilliant. I mean, it's something that they've definitely, in the tabletop game, the most recent edition, very much downplays. You don't really have... The table does exist in one appendix somewhere, but it's very much taken under advisory. So your characters are how you want them to be. And if they do experience something that changes them profoundly, then you don't get this deficit. I mean, there was a time when if your character changed alignment because of what they were doing, then you would get a level drop, which is deeply unfair.
Yeah, and it actually discourages very interesting forms of narrative development.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, Baldur's Gate deals with it by... I think the only instance where a character that you're with changes alignment is
Viconia. Viconia can as well. Viconia changes from true... she's true evil or lawful evil. She changes from lawful evil to neutral, I believe, if you follow her romance subplot through, and you are a good character. She learns from your example, by all accounts. I believe there is also a dark elf that you encounter. I can't remember it. Sulafane, the dark elf you encounter in one of the Drow cities, in the Underdark. You can turn him from the worship of Lolth to the worship of Shah, I believe.
That's interesting. I mean, I mean, there are people, I think, you sort of save and redeem in other subplots. Not many, because they do play around with that sort of tension with who is evil, who is good. The one I've just done has a group of ogres outside the village, and they're wrongly blamed for its problems.
Yes. It's the Shadow Lord, isn't it, who's responsible for that? Isn't there a clan of werewolves who are blamed for it as well, and they're not to blame either?